So you might have heard people say before that there's not just one Chinese cuisine, but there's 8 of them. But to me, I think that there has to be way, way more. So let's talk the big 8. Cantonese, Sichuan, Hunan, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Fujian, Shandong, and Anhui. Now, looking at the map there, I think that the incompleteness is probably pretty obvious. There's no Hebei, so there's going to be no liangpi, no Dongbei food, so no guobao, crispy sweet and sour pork, and no Beijing food, so no Peking duck. And the reason why that is because the Big 8 was never meant to list all of the cuisines of the country. It was an extension of the Big 4 banquet traditions of the country. The reason why Cantonese is on there and not Yunnan isn't because people in Yunnan don't have distinct food. It was because historically, Cantonese had an established system of banquet presentation that was enjoyed by the merchants and the mandarins of the Qing dynasty, and Yunnan didn't. But then, if it's not 8, how many exactly are there? I've never seen anyone attempt to count, so that's what we're gonna try to do today. But the key word there is try, because this whole exercise isn't really super obvious. Think about your own country. How many cuisines would you say that there are? For me, for America, I might list 5, but you could argue 1. You could also argue way, way more. And then there's also the question of minority cuisines, which are their own can of worms. So definitely do try to do your own country down in the comments. I'm absolutely interested. But we also thought of a couple rules of thumb to try to help guide us all through this process of culinary taxonomy. And to show you what I mean, I wanted to start off at the corner of China that we're the most familiar with, which is the Guangdong province. So our big, massive North Star in this whole thing was this. Cantonese food and Daeju food, Chaozhou food, are different. If these 2 cuisines weren't in the same country, I don't think there'd be any question about it. The staple of a Cantonese meal is white rice, while in Daeju and Chaozhou, it can be rice or it can equally be mi, which is a thin rice porridge, which is often paired with these salty preserves that are popular in the area, especially Chinese olive. Meanwhile, representative Cantonese dishes would be stuff like char siu, bak chik gai, dim sums, street nuzha, you know the stuff. While Daeju fare would be things like their famed stewed duck and goose, guoro, which is meat that's wrapped in tofu skin and deep fried, and all sorts of Lao pancakes, of which their oyster pancake is probably the most famous. Now, obviously, there's contact here. It's not like Cantonese and Daeju have nothing to do with each other. There's a ton of cultural back and forth, particularly in Hong Kong, which we'll touch on later. But even the dishes that they do share often have different versions. They both have breakfast changfen, rice noodle rolls, but the Cantonese sort is a little more restrained and often topped with a seasoned soy sauce, while the Daeju sort is loaded with fillings and smothered in gravy. I mean, shit, come on. The cities even speak different languages. If Spanish food is different from Portuguese food, I think it's fair to say that Cantonese food is different from Daeju. So our rule of thumb number 1. The 50% rule. If you'd estimate that more than 50% of the dishes are different, and the ones that are the same often have different versions, then it's a different cuisine. Now, next, let's move up the Han River to Meizhou, which is Hakka Central. Now, if you're not familiar, the Hakka are a fascinating Chinese subgroup that over the centuries migrated down from the north of China down into the south, into Guangdong, Jiangxi, Fujian, and then from there, practically the 4 corners of the earth. So they've got these dishes that, at least apocryphally, come from trying to make flour-based northern Chinese food down south of China's fabled wheat-rice divide. So things like faban, which are these fluffy cupcakes that are made from rice, all sorts of meat stuff, which I guess is supposed to be a dumpling equivalent, that sort of thing. Now, I think it'd be fair to say that this is distinct from Cantonese and Daeju, so that is cuisine number 3. But then we get to this thing called Dongjiang Hakka, which are the Hakka that are based around Huizhou, Dongguan, Dapenling, Shenzhen, these kind of places. Among Hakka chefs, Dongjiang Hakka is considered its own separate cuisine. In my personal opinion, I'm not super sure about that. Like, if we zoomed out, it feels sort of like Dongjiang Hakka is Hakka food, but with a little bit of a Cantonese accent. Like, a representative Dongjiang Hakka dish would be stuffed tofu, but a slightly different stuffed tofu than you'd find in Meizhou. But at the same time, I'm not Hakka, and I'm guessing that neither are you. They know their food better than we know their food. So, rule of thumb number 2. If the people themselves make the distinction, particularly the food world, we're going with it. We were talking to our friend up in Beijing, the food historian Thomas Dubois, who's got a new book out, by the way. And he was telling us that if we want to do this exercise proper, like in an academic context, this rule of thumb should be our definition. And then we'd do survey work to find the boundaries, which to me sounds like a fantastic idea. That is also a fantastic amount of work. And this is a YouTube video, so I think we can leave it to the grad students and we'll hop over to the other side of the Pearl River. So now, for our third rule of thumb then, I wanted to take a look at 2 cities, Taishan and Lianzhou. Now, Taishan is this really interesting place. It's got this really cool old town, and a lot of the original Chinese-American diaspora originally hailed from Taishan, and often they're pretty proud of that identity. So then, is Taishan food a separate cuisine from Cantonese? They've definitely got a few famous dishes. Their savory tangyuan are pretty renowned, ditto with a festive rice dish called yo fan. But then, at least for the Taishanese that are in Taishan, I think a lot of them would refer to their cuisine as Cantonese. And while I'm not completely sure, I also don't think that it would pass the 50% test. It feels a little like that old linguistics debate about dialects versus languages. To me, Taishan food feels a little like a dialect within Cantonese food, ditto with Shunda or Gaoming, and that all of these together create a larger family. So what we wanted to try to do was borrow the idea of mutual intelligibility from linguistics. That is, can these places understand each other culinarily? Now, I know that that might sound pretty weird, so this was our thought experiment. I want you to imagine an old, talented home cook from the area. Like in our mind's eye for Cantonese, we were thinking of Dawei, Steph's dad. Now imagine that you sat them down and had them try a dish from a different city. Would they, just from taste, be able to recreate it? For Taishan, I think that Dawei would probably be able to sort of yo fan. It might not be perfect, but I think it'd probably be recognizable. But now let's swing north to that city of Lianzhou. It's not the most famous city internationally. It's up there in the hills. There's a bit of Yao people influence, and representative dishes would be things like deep-fried beef pancake, leaf-wrapped pork, and beef noodles with chili. And so while I don't know, I don't think that Dawei would be able to sort these, so I think that we might be able to put Lianzhou as distinct. And then final rule of thumb before we get into the list proper, gradient zones must be broken somewhere. So like when you're doing this exercise, I think often you'll find cases a little bit like this. So like Samyup Cantonese feels to me like it should really be grouped in with Guangzhou Cantonese, Sayup with Samyup, Yangjiang with Sayup, Leizhou with Yangjiang, and then Beihai over in Guangxi province together with Leizhou. But then if we take Beihai and Guangzhou, the two feel totally different. I consider this area to be a gradient zone. To continue, we just have to put the pin in there somewhere. It's gonna be arbitrary. We put it here at the Yangjiang-Maoming border, but you could totally put your own pin and it would be equally valid. But either way, this is Guangdong to us. 6 cuisines. I think maybe you could argue 3 or 4, maybe more, but I've got a lot of confidence that this is roughly within the right ballpark. Now, next, I am going to breathlessly break down the rest of the country. But before I do, we should be upfront here that Guangdong is the area that we know the best, and to a lesser extent, Guizhou, Guangxi, Sichuan, and Yunnan. The more you know a place, the more granular that you can get. We've missed stuff, I'm sure of it. I promise that when we're 70, we'll circle back to this video and try to fill in all the gaps that we've learned. But either way, here we go. Next province over, Guangxi, criminally underrated, best or second best rice noodles in the world, depending on how you rate Vietnam. Along the coast is the aforementioned Guangdong-ish culinary zone. Moving north, we've got the continuation of the Pearl River system with its predictable Cantonese influences, albeit maybe Cantonese's wild or kinkier cousin. It's a cuisine that internationally is maybe a little infamous for its love of dog. Don't talk shit unless you're a vegetarian. But other representative dishes would include lemon duck, paper-wrapped chicken, and my favorite, Old Buddy noodles. Moving west, we've got a cuisine heavily influenced by the Zhuang ethnic group, a Thai-speaking ethnic group that was actually the province's original inhabitants. And serve up fare like five-color rice, yaba, and a chicken rice noodle soup with herbs that, whether it has anything to do with foga, I'll leave up to you. Moving north, we're starting to get into an area that's starting to be a bit of a gradient zone in with West Hunan. Stunningly gorgeous pocket of the country, by the way, where you can get the famed Guili Mifun, Maro Mishan, and beerfish. Moving north, the Guizhou province. Rugged, mountainous, awesome food, maybe my favorite in the world, but probably a more accurate map here would delineate just as much on altitude as it would latitude and longitude. In the lowlands, we've got Han, Guizhou, particularly the cities of Guiyang, Anhui, and Zunyi. Representative dishes being Yangrofun, goat rice noodle soup, which is super popular all throughout China these days, Docher hot pot, and Anshun posubao, a lard-laminated sourdough baozi that might just be the very best baozi in the world. In the mountains, you can find Meng, Buyi, and Dongguizhou, which will kind of cluster as one in focus in the mountainous south. The most famous food there is probably the Meng fermented tomato catfish soup, Suantangyu. But in the Dong pockets, you can also find fare like Niu Bie and fermented shrimp paste beef pot, flavors that remind me so much of Lao cuisine that it kind of hurts my brain. In the west of the province, we are starting to get into a gradient zone in with Han Yunnan, so maybe for convenience sake, we can stop at the province border and draw a line there. So real quick, this is me from the future editing this, and I felt like maybe I needed to clarify something real quick. Because we talked a good bit about how we think about the cuisines in Chinese cuisines, maybe a little bit overly exhaustively, but we haven't really touched on how we think about the Chinese in the Chinese cuisines. Now, I'm sure for a couple of you that might be kind of the elephant in the room here. So we were thinking about Chinese cuisines from two perspectives, a traveling perspective and a sort of like taxonomy angle. Now, like the traveling perspective is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward that a Chinese cuisine is something that exists within the political entity of mainland China. Like with the low entry price of one tourist visa, you get access to all these cuisines. Now, the taxonomy angle is something that I find pretty interesting, but it's also a lot more difficult because like, you could make a pretty convincing argument that Japanese food is more closely related to Han Chinese than Hmong or Miao is to Han Chinese. So for simplicity, for this video, we basically went with the traveling perspective. But we also included up on our map here a couple of the more closely related cuisines we think outside of mainland China that we'll be talking more about in the Substack post. So yeah. You can disagree, but like, this is a food video. Take it as it is. Back to Yunnan. So Han Yunnan, meanwhile, is centered around the Kunming Plateau, and so predictably, the cities of Kunming together with Yuxi and Jianshui. But it does extend up into Chujing and Xuanwei, which might just be the very best places to eat this stuff because like, ingredient quality is just out of this world.
Yeah, so this is natural light. This is pork. This is what pork should look like.
Representative dishes include the spicy little pot rice noodles, the not spicy crossing the bridge rice noodles, fresh fried chicken, and the traveler favorite of xiao'er kwai, which is kind of like a Yunnan rice batter burrito. Intermingled with Han Yunnan is Hui, or Muslim Yunnan, which has a lot of crossover, but I would still call it distinct. Representative dishes include a lamb soup that's a classic at the weekend markets there, dasu nuro mian, and nugamba beef jerky, which would feed the province's famed Muslim caravans. Famous because these mountain ranges in the middle here are crazy difficult to traverse and historically really sliced Yunnan into 3 distinct trading networks. The West traded just as much with Upper Burma and the Shan Hills, and show it with the Lapid-adjacent Chaya Do, Shidofan porridge, and my favorite, the Achang people's crossing the hand rice noodle. The South, especially around Puar and Sipsongpana, had a similar relationship with Lana in Thailand. And so in addition to some spicy dips called saz and leaf-wrapped meats called bao shao, there's also these dye-flavored salads that are this fascinating pit stop in between Chinese and Thai culinary ideas. The Honghe South, meanwhile, is a little bit more of a hodgepodge, with stuff like honey grilled fish, dipping sauce chicken, and peanut milk soup. Then moving up is what we'll call Dali cuisine, which is super influenced by the mountains with its famed acid-set cheeses, chickpea liangfen, and swamugua fish. And as we follow north, we've got Tibetan Yunnan, so Tibet. Now, when it comes to Tibetan food, if you've traveled to like the Tibetan communities in Nepal or even some of the tourist haunches in China, you might have been introduced to some rather exciting looking Tibetan food. But to me, those are kind of fusions. Out there on the plateau, in my personal experience at least, the fare is a little bit more interesting than exciting. I mean, I think to really appreciate this kind of food, you really need to internalize that the Tibetan plateau is an unfathomably harsh environment. The fact that humans, a culture, manage to live here, thrive here, really is just a testament to just how staggering human adaptiveness can be. In the West, we tend to have this stereotype of Tibetans as like these huggy-wuggy Buddhist hippies, but that's not my stereotype. No, at their core, people everywhere are people. But my mental shortcut is that Tibetans are fucking badasses, and so is the food. I mean, like, the staple grain tsampa is a roasted barley flour that's practically eaten straight. The tea's salted. You're not going to be able to put this stuff on the menu of your cool guy hipster fusion bar in Austin. But in a survival scenario, I'm going with these guys. Now, of course, the Tibetan plateau is massive, extending into the west of Sichuan into the Gadze and Ngawa regions. So most of what you would recognize as Sichuan food is clustered around the center and the east of the province, together with Chongqing. But there's also this little nub here that's jutting down into Yunnan, which has a unique cuisine that's heavily influenced by Yi people food, with dishes like totuo ro, naked baba, and Yi-style barbecue. Now, Sichuan cuisine proper is generally divided by Sichuan chefs into 3 sub-cuisines: Shanghebang, the upper river school, Xiahebang, the lower river school, and Yanbangcai, the salt gang school, named because of the salt merchants that were historical to that area. Now, this is one of those internal divisions. I think that there's a lot of crossover, especially in a modern Sichuan restaurant environment. But of the 3, Shanghebang is centered around Chengdu and is generally the least spicy, with dishes like gongbao jiding, mapo tofu, and twice-cooked pork. The lower river, the name referring to being downriver along the Yangtze, is centered around Chongqing and Wanzhou, and is probably the most spicy, with fare like Chongqing hot pot, Wanzhou grilled fish, and Mao blood flourishing. The Yanbangcai, meanwhile, might be somewhere in between the two, and could maybe be best summed up with the phrase, huo da you duo, wei jing ji jing qi tuo tuo. They've got a particularly notable love for the savory douhua that's popular in this whole swath, and the area is also the birthplace of dishes like shuiju beef and burning noodles. Then, moving down the river past Chongqing, we get to the Hubei province. Now, Hubei's a little bit hard to parse because there's a ton of city-by-city diversity here, but they all do seem to cluster around certain concepts: beef and fish, steam and braises, a love of the chili pepper, and baijiu for breakfast. Representative dishes would be stuff like yugao fish cake, sanqian doupi, which is a sort of savory and incredible sticky rice tofu pancake, and, of course, the world-famous Wuhan hot dry noodle. There's probably groupings in there that we missed, but the one bit that is undeniably different is the Tujia area of Anshi, which is really starting to get a lot of crossover with West Hunan. So then, the Hunan province. Now, if I could think of one adjective to describe Hunan food, it would be xiafan, awesome with rice. In my opinion, the very best way to experience this stuff is with a big bowl of rice and just go along for the ride, with dishes like chili fried meat, smoked bamboo shoots with Chinese bacon, and golden coin eggs. That said, I'd be remiss not to also give Hunan rice noodles their fair shake. Changde beef rice noodles, probably the most famous throughout China, but Yufan fish rice noodles is my personal favorite. In the west of the province is a very mountainous region that's influenced quite a bit by the minority groups in that area, with some incredible food that definitely bleeds in with my favorite Guizhou. These pounded dips are awesome. They've also got these sokarat sandwiches, which are just as good as you'd think they'd be, and they're famous for blood duck, though these days you can also find blood duck variants in pockets all around Hunan. Then, moving east, we are starting to get into a pocket that's a gradient zone together with the Jiangxi province, which does undeniably share some similar ideas. Like in Shenzhen, whenever I'd ask somebody from there about Jiangxi cuisine, a lot of people would respond to me that Jiangxi doesn't have a cuisine, which is obviously bollocks because they've got some awesome dishes. I mean, spicy stir-fried rice noodles, la jizhua, and their famed clay jar soups. But if you were a lumper, there does undeniably seem to be a lot of crossover with Hunan. In the mountainous northeast of the province, though, around the famed porcelain town of Jingdezhen, it does start getting quite different, though, with dishes like qigao pancake, dengzhanguo, and nut tofu. In the south, in Guangzhou, it's really starting to get pretty Hakka. And this area could kind of be thought of as a border town between the Hunan/Jiangxi and Hakka/Guangdong culinary worlds. Moving due east from there, though, is Longyan, which I think would be fair to group in with Meizhou Hakka. But then we get to the Fujian coast with Minnan or Hokkien cuisine and its rich banquet tradition. But to me, what's really interesting about this area is the food's international and even Southeast Asian influences, owing to the area's historical status as a nexus of maritime trade in Asia. It's subtle, but it's there, and it's findable in dishes like shacha sauce and curry beef, but maybe more classically Minnan dishes might be stuff like mian xianhu, vinegar pork, xianfan, and their own variant of oyster omelet. Then moving north, we have min bei, which impressed me personally with its sweet and sours, and what became my all-time favorite liver dish of nanjiangan, which is flash fried in lard. Other representative dishes there would be Fuzhou fish balls, Buddha jumps over the wall, and guobianhu. Going up the Min River, then, is a pocket that's just awesome. Sanming and Shaxian, famed across China because of the chain Shaxian Snacks, which is a reasonable representation of the food, but it's so much better in Shaxian. They've got peanut noodles mixed with lard, Shaxian wontons, mi pi dong, banya, and the xiaomai, which aren't on the Shaxian Snacks menu, but are just something else. This little mountain town should absolutely be more on the food tourism radar, at the very least domestically. Then, moving north, is the Wu Chinese cultural-linguistic sphere, which you'll notice has a lot of internal divisions on our map. And that's because this area of the country has some of the richest written culinary history in the country, and so the food world there really likes to delineate a lot of schools. So we've got a lot of sub-cuisines. Most synonymous with the Zhejiang province is probably the Hangzhou school, which is sometimes derided by northerners as too sweet, with dishes like candied ham, pianar chuan, and longjing shrimp. Moving over is Shaoxing, which we agree is definitely distinct. You've probably heard of their rice wine, and a lot of the food there is stuff perfect to wash that down, like the steamed double stinky, fennel broad beans, and sauce-preserved duck. It's a gorgeous walkable old town, by the way, well worth a trip from Shanghai. Following down the river there is Ningbo, which does share a lot with the rest of the coast, I think, but is definitely famed for their Ningbo-style rice cakes and the Ningbo braised three delicacies. The remainder of the coast, then, Wenzhou, Lishui, and Taizhou, is collectively referred to as O, and serve up seafood-laden fare like jiaxiao fish, loaded sticky rice, and smashed shrimp noodles. In the mountains of O, though, there is this one little She people autonomous region, which has some unique dishes like edamame tofu and black sticky rice. The city of Jinhua there, though, was kind of hard to categorize, sort of a shatter zone there between the O, Hangzhou, and Jiangxi mountains, but it is a tasty place. They're obviously famed for their ham, but their jidanguo and vinegar chicken are also heavily recommended. And then we get to Shanghai. Now, this is our own distinction, and definitely feel free to disagree. They've obviously got a lot of similarities to the surrounding areas. But on our map here, there were 4 places that were really quite awkward, and that's Shanghai, Hong Kong, Tianjin, and Harbin, each one of which you could easily map like this. But the way people eat in each area has this imprint of Western influence. Like, throughout the world, colonialism undeniably brought a lot of things, but it also brought bread. Like, Hong Kong is very, very Cantonese. But then the question was, what do we do with cha chan teng, those Canto Western diners that we love so much on this channel? Is Canto Western, with its pineapple buns, cheesy seafood rice, Swiss chicken wings, and macaroni soup, its own cuisine? I mean, it's a staple to eat outside in Hong Kong, but it's not just a restaurant concept, because people also make the stuff at home as well. But at the same time, it's also not like Hong Kong people don't also eat a bunch of Cantonese food. So our decision here was that cha chan teng isn't a cuisine. It's an element of a cuisine that makes Hong Kong distinct from the rest of Cantonese. Tianjin has a similar thing going on with their curries and their white sauce dishes and otherwise pretty northern cuisine. Heilongjiang, meanwhile, is very much Dongbei food, but Dongbei food with some Russian influence, as evidenced by their love of kielbasa and sourdough bread. And Shanghai, next to their famed shengjian baos and their fantuans, also has a school of Western food called Haipai Western. And like schnitzel is a home cooking classic, and the bakeries are a cultural institution. But there is undeniably a lot of crossover with neighboring Wuxi and Suzhou, right there next door, with their cherry pork, Wuxi hot and sour, and big meat noodles. Then north of the river is Huayang, which is probably what people in China would likely think of if you said the words Jiangsu food. Traditionally speaking, it's a delicate cuisine with a deep history. Representative dishes being lion's head meatball, dajugansi, and Yangzhou-style dim sums. But there's also something a little bit awkward about this area, in that was the food of the elite, and then developing alongside of it was humble and sometimes even fiery fare, like choudayuan and braised old goose. This cuisine today being referred to as tu cai. These days, both are enjoyed by the people in the region, so we counted it as one. But just know that the food there might get a little bipolar. Nanjing, meanwhile, being the capital for more than a hot second, has some historical differences and its own historical school. But these days, I think, is really more of the duck capital, with their roast duck, stuffed duck, salt poached duck, and duck blood noodle soup. The crawfish is also really good. Then we move over to the Anhui province, aka the Big Eight cuisine that's probably the most difficult to find outside of China. Now, what's generally thought of as Hui Cai is usually what you'd find in the south along the Yangtze River. It's particularly famous for its tofu, representative dishes being hairy tofu, fermented vegetable braised tofu, and yipingguo. But also in Anhui, there's this little mountainous bit right here with some pretty interesting stuff going on, such as stinky tofu guoba and their hanging pots, which were traditionally served over fire pit. Then, moving north in Anhui, we get to Zhongyuan, the central China plain. Now, the Central China Plain is the historical cradle of Chinese civilization, and an extensive definition would include northern Anhui, northern Jiangsu, western Shandong, Hebei, but especially Hunan. Now, if there's one rule of thumb when it comes to Chinese cuisines, it's this: the flatlands connect and the mountains divide. So sometimes looking from the direction of the mountainous south, it can sometimes feel like there's a lot of similarities north of the Yangtze. But that's also not totally fair because we're a lot less educated on northern Chinese food than we are southern. So for this bit, we got a little bit of help. Our friend and patron and Beijing native, Wu Zheng, who helpfully wrote us a small thesis on the topic, and I'll leave you his unfiltered analysis down in the description box. In the end, he was actually a little bit more of a lumper than we were, but we mostly went with his divisions. So right, northern Anhui, we've got lamb noodles, xianmo, and Anhui Zhejiang edamame. Then, northern Jiangsu is quite different from the rest of that province, with dishes like Suzhou spicy soup, sadzi rolls, and Diguo chicken. But you could maybe lump it in with northern Anhui if you were feeling in a lumpy mood. Henan, meanwhile, does definitely have some sub-schools centered around Luoyang and Kaifeng, but it can be kind of difficult to parse the differences as an outsider. But either way, serves up some incredibly underrated fare like huimian braised noodles, these big zhuangmos, and their famed hot pepper soup. The Zhongyan side of Shandong, though, is undeniably its own thing, classically called lu cai, and was one of the first cuisines to really systematize stocks and sauces in China. So there are these famed banquet dishes there, like nine twist intestine and pucai and milky fish stock. But there's also obviously a bit more humble fare too, like Chinese leek jianbing and dezhou paji, which is a chicken that's so tender that you can chew right through the bones. Hopping on the other side of the mountains real quick, though, is a not Zhongyuan area that's much more influenced by the ocean, with some classic dishes there being scallion braised sea cucumber, everybody's favorite penis fish, and of course, seafood dumplings. Up in Shanxi, we've got a province that might just have the highest degree of dough-making capability per capita of anywhere on planet Earth. If you love starch, you will absolutely love the Shanxi province, with their cow lao lao, knife-cut noodles, and stone-baked flatbread. Then we get to the Hubei province, which is often kind of slagged on culinarily by the rest of the country, sort of like the England of China. And a little like England, I don't think it quite deserves the reputation. I mean, come on, there's lionfish, braised donkey sandwich, and nowhere that has dumplings this good deserves to be slagged on by anyone. And nestled inside, of course, is Beijing with its imperial influences. So imperial hot pot, naibobo, and obviously everybody's actual favorite, Peking duck. Then, for the Northeast, if you're eating this stuff outside the region in China, usually it's all lumped together as Dongbei food. But there's really a Dongbei food of the coast and a Dongbei food of the interior. Jilin sort of fits my personal stereotype of Dongbei food with classics like guobao rou, swancai pork belly, and iron pot braises. The coast definitely has some crossover, for sure. But they also serve up dishes like shrimp paste braised squid, seaweed pancake, and sanjian menzi. As an aside though, no matter what, if you're eating around this corner of the country, bring friends. The portion sizes are legendary and would make a Cheesecake Factory manager blush. But we shouldn't forget, also in the Northeast, is this little interesting bit right here, which has a lot of ethnic Koreans living there. If you've ever heard Koreans and Chinese online arguing about whether or not China has kimchi, it does, because there's millions of ethnic Koreans living in China, and from there, the rest of Dongbei also developed a taste for it. As an aside, this right here might be a nice choice to try some more North Korean style fare in case you were curious and didn't really feel like the whole Kim Dynasty guided tour. And then we get to Inner Mongolia, which is a little bit of an awkward province. Because, the place is massive. And a lot like Outer Mongolia, it's really sparsely populated. An ethnic map of the province would probably look a lot like the election map of an American state. The populated urban cores are one thing, and the land on the map can be a different thing altogether. That said, the Mongolian and nomadic influences are absolutely there. Tons of mud. But in the urban east, that's mixing with northeast Chinese, and in the urban west, that's mixing with northwestern Chinese. And speaking of northwestern Chinese, we've also got Shanxi, Gansu, Ningxia, Qinghai, and Xinjiang. Now, outside the region, restaurants in China will usually categorize themselves as one of two things: Northwestern or Xinjiang. Now, Xinjiang food, it has to be said, is absolutely fucking incredible. If a fusion of Northwest Chinese and Central Asian sounds up your alley, and it absolutely should, you are going to love Xinjiang food. Now, there's obviously a patchwork of ethnic groups that make up the Xinjiang province, but the predominant non-nomadic ethnic groups in the region are the Uyghurs and the Han Chinese, and so I think would make for logical subcuisines. Han Xinjiang food would be stuff like Xinjiang rice noodles, jiaoma chicken, and big plate chicken, while Uyghur fare would be stuff like polo, samsas, and naan. But in a modern restaurant setting, whether it's Han run or Uyghur run, restaurant menus will usually contain both, and there also seems to be a bit of crossover in home cooking too. For the rest of the Northwest, probably the epicenter there is Lanzhou, home of the famous Lanzhou hand-pulled noodles. Muslim Chinese and Muslim Chinese influenced, this swath also has dishes like niangpi and sweet fermented oat. And then lastly, we get to Shanxi, which has its own internal classification of North, Central, and South. Central is based around Xi'an and is probably what a lot of you would think of as Shanxi food, with biang biang noodles, their slippery liangpi, and their legendary roe jammies. The north, meanwhile, is a really rugged mountainous area, with specialties like potato caca and jianbing rolls, and the south, with dishes like potato ciba and hot mipi, is a sort of Sichuan-Xi'an fusion that honestly seems pretty incredible. And so, almost forgot Hainan. We talked before about that Guangdong cuisinary zone, but I would be remiss not to mention northern Hainan's chicken rice and also Leizhou's duck rice. In the south, there's obviously that tourist haunch of Sanya, which mostly serves tourist food, but that city is part of a really interesting mountainous region with a lot of ethnic Lai influence and has stuff like leaf banquets, sour fermented fish, and sour fermented meat. Then there's also Wanning, super interesting spot with a community of Indonesian Chinese that's its own story. And so that's it for mainland China, 63 cuisines. And we'll cover the rest outside of the mainland in the linked Substack post below, where there's another 6 to 11, depending on how you count. Now, I can foresee the comments here. I know that some people are going to disagree with some of our decisions. I know that a couple people are going to yell at us. But if there's one, and only one thing that I hope that this video can convince you of, it's that if you love food, you should travel to mainland China. Is it the easiest place in the world to travel to? No. If you don't know Chinese, the language barrier can get intense. Mobile payment systems for foreigners are kludgy at best. And while every hotel on trip.com accepts foreigners, outside of that ecosystem, it can get a little touch and go, even though it's ostensibly the law of the land. Immigration has taken a page recently from America's book and started kind of grilling travelers at the border, which isn't the most welcoming feeling as a tourist. Google Maps doesn't work in China, and Dianping, the Chinese Yelp, doesn't work without a Chinese phone number. But if you want easy, go to Disneyland. Because there's simply nowhere on planet Earth that, one, has such mind-numbing culinary diversity, that two, is just so accessible. There's definitely diversity in India, there's diversity in Southeast Asia, there's diversity in Indonesia. But here, a lot of those sub-cuisines are commercialized, so you can eat them at restaurants. And there's also a high-speed rail system that you can easily get to practically everywhere on this map. You just go to the China Metro, boop your passport, And you can be from urban Guangdong to the mountains of Guizhou in like 3 hours. Long term, will this convenience lead to a culinary sameness in the same way the interstate highway did to America? Maybe. Probably. But not yet. As food lovers, we have a once-in-a-generation chance to explore all of this, and we'd be stupid not to take advantage. So yeah, 63 cuisines in mainland China. Check out the Substack post for more. Huge thank you to everybody that's supporting us on Patreon. There's going to be a proper recipe video next week, I promise. And subscribe for more Chinese cooking videos.